My name is Stephanie Fassler. I am the Vice President of Operations and the International Affairs Director for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council, I welcome you to this foreign policy panel, Games That Unite, the Role of Sports in Diplomacy. Many thanks to our strategic partners, the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center, for their wonderful hospitality and the provision of this beautiful venue to host our public events. These programs are filmed for our YouTube channel and will be made available within 24 hours. When Korea beat Germany on June 27th, sending Mexico into the knockout round of the World Cup, Mexican fans around the world professed their newfound goodwill towards Korea. Does this affinity, brought about by a sporting event, transfer to better relations between the countries? There are historical examples of sports playing a role in international affairs, though not always positive. In 1969, tensions between Honduras and El Salvador erupted into what became known as the Soccer Wars, following a 1970 World Cup qualifying match. 100 hours of war was only resolved by a ceasefire negotiated by the Organization of American States. The United States boycott of the 1980 Summer Olympics in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is another example of the negative connotation of sports in foreign affairs. However, sports and sporting events can bring countries together. President Richard Nixon's opening of relations with China was preceded by ping-pong diplomacy, where the U.S. and China hosted players from either country on tours. The U.S. State Department's sports diplomacy programs have sent sports envoys to hold clinics for young people and participate in community outreach activities overseas. Which brings us back to the question: are sports a tool for diplomacy? And if so, to what extent? In what other ways are sports used on the international stage? We turn now to our panel of experts. Ambassador Lino Gutierrez is the Executive Director of the Una Chapman Cox Foundation and an adjunct professor at the George Washington University. During Ambassador Gutierrez's 29-year career in the Foreign Service, he has served as U.S. Ambassador to Argentina and Nicaragua. He has also been posted to U.S. missions in the Dominican Republic, Bahamas, France, Portugal, and Haiti. He served as Acting Assistant Secretary of State in the Western Hemisphere from 1999 to 2001, and after retiring in 2006, he was a senior advisor to the Secretary of Commerce. Soolmaz Abooali is a professor of sport, conflict resolution, and diplomacy at George Mason University. She has worked on sports diplomacy, conflict resolution initiatives with the United States Institute of Peace, the United States Department of State, the President's Council on Fitness, Sports, and Nutrition, and non-governmental organizations. She is a 12-time U.S. national champion, world medalist, and USA team member in traditional karate. She is working on her PhD at George Mason University with her dissertation, A Theory-Practice Exploration into How Sports is Used to Address Conflict. Our moderator, Noah Frank, is the digital sports editor for the radio station WTOP. At WTOP, he's reported on everything from brain injuries in football to life behind the scenes of minor league baseball. With a career in journalism since age 17, Noah is a 2-time National Headline Award winner. He recently published a series about cultural hubs in the D.C. area for immigrant communities watching their home countries play in the World Cup. Please join me in welcoming our panelists to this special program.
Thank you, Stephanie. Stick to sports. It's a phrase you've probably all heard, and one that I've certainly been told many times from all the brave corners of the internet. It's comforting to some to think of sports as entirely escapist, to believe that from the time you enter the arena until you leave it, everything is immune from the challenges and the politics of the world beyond the gates. Of course, that's not true. It's never been true. Jesse Owens upstaged Hitler at his own Olympics in Berlin in 1936. Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball 17 years before the Civil Rights Act was signed. Baseball parks didn't even play God Bless America on Sundays during the 7th-inning stretch after taking me out to the ball game until after September 11th. On Sunday, France will play for the World Cup title, led by a scintillating 19-year-old Kylian Mbappe, the Parisian-born son to a Cameroonian father and an Algerian mother. Stephanie mentioned the raucous celebration by Mexico fans, literally lifting up Koreans in jubilation. But we've seen the other side in this World Cup. A group of England supporters celebrated eliminating Sweden by, yes, trashing an IKEA. Our sports and our politics have always been intertwined. The only question there's ever really been on the topic is whether or not we acknowledge this fact, and whether we use the games to bring countries and communities closer together, or whether the energy and goodwill generated by these events is co-opted and used to advance political purposes. I'm honored to be joined by our two panelists tonight, each of whom provides a unique perspective into the many ways that sports both reflect and drive social and political movements in this country and around the world. So I want to start with you, Soolmaz. You have a very different perspective on this, being an athlete yourself who's competed in international competitions and now going into this as part of your career. I'm interested, on a personal level, what have you found in your competitions? Do you still think that spirit of common ground through sport exists? Do you still find that common ground through your competitions? And on a professional level, have you seen that sort of play out in ways that you've studied?
Thank you. Can you guys, is this good? Okay. Thank you so much again for to our hosts and as well as my co-panelists. So I'll begin with giving, to answer that question, a little bit of a roundabout or a comprehensive answer, just a little bit from what I study, what I found, and then move into a little bit more of my personal experiences as a martial artist who competes internationally. So at first, I'd like to talk about sport and how we use sport to address conflict. Second, again, I'll talk as an athlete. It's important to understand, first and foremost, that sport is not a panacea. It's not a cure-all. It won't resolve conflict per se, and it won't do good solely on its own. It's also important to acknowledge that sport is kind of like that popular kid that we all wanted to be associated with, right? It's got appeal, it's fun, it's energetic, it's spirited. And so because of that, we've seen sport play out at the micro level, at the meso level, and at the macro level. So at the micro level, so for example, people-to-people exchanges, it provides opportunities to bring people together, perhaps the opportunities that might not have existed before. It helps foster understanding. It helps humanize the other. It can help to build friendships that will hopefully defy the norms in a particular region that has some sort of conflict between groups going on. At the meso level, there are NGOs, very, very good NGOs who are working really steadfastly and very dedicated to using sport as a vehicle to create some sort of social change. They address issues that are related to obesity and improving physical fitness, integrating refugees into their new communities, addressing trauma, which is very huge now, especially in the sports world. Most of these entities started off with feel-good stories and happy pictures, right? They said, sport is great, this is how we're using it, look how happy everyone is, give us money, fund us to have these programs. And then the trend was that, well, we actually need a little bit more than qualitative like data and happy pictures. We want a little bit more of quantitative proof that what you're doing works. So the shift came into monitoring and evaluating these programs. And that's good. And then a closer look, though, at a sample of these NGOs shows that a more fundamental problem is really how are people thinking about sport as a tool to resolve conflict? What is the thought process behind why sport is being used? Why even sport, right? Forget proving that it works or forget programs, but let's back up a little bit and figure out what is it about sport. And so this is really the one of the main issues that need to be addressed now in this field. And I found through my research that a lot of the the people working in this Sport for Peace field, they are very good intentioned, very passionate, and they rely heavily on their own personal stories of success. Like sport, for example, empowered me, made me a more focused person, confident person, and this is why I believe sport works. And so now I'm going to design a program that can help others feel the same way and therefore become successful in their life. And that's great. That's all fantastic. And I'm one of those people who you will hear saying that. But again, we need to focus more on the research which is being done. We need to develop. We need to think. We need to explore more of our thinking behind this field. So in order to address conflict, which a lot of these programs do, our work really needs to be driven by more than these personal stories. We need to have a multi-pronged approach to addressing conflict. While I turn my cheat sheet. We have to, again, more and more so have a deeper understanding of what is conflict. So you have these programs that are looking at conflict. They go into this very conflict-prone society, right? Let's say refugees are coming in and the refugees are having a conflict with the locals who are in the community. That's a really tense situation to go into. So we need to step back and really understand what is conflict, how do we resolve it, how do we go about it. So conflict is complex. It requires a change in attitudes, behaviors, and also the context. And it's that way because we as humans are complex beings. So at the macro level, we see a lot of governments and NGOs who have invested in these programs, and as the ambassador will probably talk a little bit more about that, I'm sure. There are three primary ways that this is done. These NGOs, or these organizations and these governments, they fund major sporting events, which helps to bolster a country's image. They promote a sports that seemingly exemplifies a specific culture's values. And they also engage athletes as envoys to go around and communicate the country's culture and values as well. So I'll skip a little bit to this part. One of my first exposures to sport being used in a broad sense was in 1997 at the World Cup in Lyon, France. I was sitting in the stadium, and all of a sudden I see these yellow T-shirts showing up all across the stadium. And so it was one of the largest Iranian opposition groups to the Iranian regime, who had used the event to basically transmit a message to the Iranian government. And so I was there to watch a football game, but then here I was in the middle of politics and sports colliding, which was really, really fascinating. And that, of course, imprinted me. It was imprinted in my memory. So I'll move over to myself as an athlete. I have had the pleasure of traveling to over 10 countries where I've represented the U.S. And it's been a great honor and an experience, especially in what I do, which is you're standing in front of someone and you're trying to outdo them with your punches and kicks and your speed and all that, athletic stuff. And then a couple minutes later, we step out and we're shaking hands and we're hugging and we're trying to communicate without having a language. But then again, our language is that martial art, is the actual competition, is that fighting that we've been doing. And so that has always been very unique to me and has stuck with me as an athlete and also as a scholar moving into this field. So I don't really know if I answered your question, but that was kind of this long about way of giving a kind of my view, professional and personal view of this Sport for Peace field.
Well, before I get to Ambassador Gutierrez, I wanted to draw on something that you said, which was, you mentioned conflict and resolving conflict. And sports themselves are sort of a placeholder for conflict. They're a substitution for conflict. They're a way that we can express ourselves physically without necessarily having to battle between towns or countries or any of that. It has stepped into that place on some level. I'm curious because you participate in such a physical sport as opposed to my favorite sport, which is baseball, where the purpose is to swing a wooden bat and to run around a square more than the other team, which is a little more esoteric than beating the person in front of you than physically it's translated a few steps away. Do you think that there's something about martial arts or something about your specific sport that is maybe more of a pure distillation of that concept of taking what used to be, actual conflict and bringing it into an arena where we all agree on rules and we can participate and have a result that everybody agrees with.
Yeah, so a quick distinction. What I do is called traditional karate, which is different from MMA. Mixed martial arts is kind of its own animal, right? In my opinion, it's pretty barbaric. It's kind of just free all. You might as well just take out the cage and be in the street. It's a street fight, right? Again, having said that, though, I have respect for the athletes. They train hard. I know what it's like to train in this competition and at that level. So I have respect for the people who bring themselves up to that level, right? But the way the whole thing is composed itself is very different from traditional karate, which is a traditional style of Japanese martial arts, and it's based on a fundamental concept called Budo, right? Which is loosely translated is like the martial way, but the idea of Budo, which this traditional karate is grounded in, is that you use your life, whatever you do, and in this case, through the martial arts training, to develop yourself mentally, physically, and spiritually so that you are a responsible, moral, ethical citizen in society. So it's not just that I can go stand in front of you and I can just make you all bloody or whatever, or I just beat you and then walk away with my medal, right? That I can just go to a store and purchase myself, maybe. But it's the idea is that you are there in front of the person, you respect that person by being in front of them, and you give that person the opportunity to test themselves, test their skills, and also give you the opportunity to test your skills against one another. But we're still watching out for each other. We're still not trying to completely knock out the other person, right, or harm the other person. And before we get to that point, through our practice, our ultimate goal is not the gold medal, is to become that responsible citizen. So I think when it's grounded in that kind of mentality, then it is possible. It is possible to have kind of a different result come out.
Okay, Ambassador Gutierrez.
Yes.
You've both in your personal life and your professional life have seen and been a part of diplomatic efforts through sports in the United States and around the world. I'm interested in what you've seen of the many different efforts that you've been involved in or have seen from afar. What has worked and what hasn't, and in defining that, what are some efforts that you think have been successful and how has that sort of translated into tangible results, and maybe what are some efforts that didn't turn out the way that you expected?
Well, let me start with a personal vignette. A few months ago, I was watching the college football championship game when Alabama played Georgia. And as a graduate of the University of Alabama, I had a vested interest in the game. When Alabama plays, I am a wreck. I cannot be at a bar with other people. My wife knows to stay away. It is just a roller coaster of emotions. And this game was no different because we were losing, then winning, then losing. We were in overtime, 2nd and 26. The Georgia fans are celebrating, and magic happens. A touchdown pass. And I went from the depths of despair to the ecstasy of victory. And that is a feeling that sports cause, that governments try to channel in some way to their advantage. So it is not surprising that sports have been used in many ways since the beginning of history, going back to the original Olympic Games, when legend had it that war stopped while communities and cities competed against each other. In fact, wars didn't stop, but that is a legend. And in fact, it wasn't all peace and love because there were sacrifices to Zeus and people were being killed too. But they did produce a certain amount of harmony, and the athletes were revered as, demigods, pretty much. And this feeling of the brotherhood of man, I think as Stephanie said, there is a positive and a negative side to the use of sports. The idea would be, in the positive sense, to use sports as a soft power, what Joe and I described as differentiating from hard power, which is the U.S. military or other diplomatic tools, to use U.S. culture. Believe it or not, McDonald's, American movies, and sports is a big part of that. You go all over the world and you talk about LeBron James, everybody knows who you're talking about. And to use that to channel it somehow in the promotion of our values, et cetera. So there are many examples in history of good gestures, like when Nixon went to China in the 1970s, the first baby steps in relations between the U.S. and China, because we had not recognized the People's Republic of China ever, was to send a ping pong team, because ping pong is a national sport in China. We did not send Forrest Gump, despite what the movie says, but maybe these people are too young to remember Forrest Gump, I don't know. But, you know, goodwill is something that can be promoted through sports, between cultures, between countries. The U.S. has had sports ambassadors we have sent to other countries, people like Michelle Kwan, ice skating champion, Cal Ripken, to countries where baseball is played. There's a long tradition. Even when the New York Yankees went to Japan in the 1930s, there was some State Department sponsorship in sending Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig to Japan. So I think that is the positive side of sports. And we saw it in the recent Olympics when South Korea reached out to North Korea at a time when Kim Jong-un was trying his ballistic missiles over the coast or the territory of Japan and scaring the heck out of everybody. The South Korean government reached out, invited North Korea, and North Korea accepted. And that helped diffuse the tensions, I think. So there are many instances of countries trying to come together through sports. There are also attempts to use sports in a negative way to promote an ideology. That's, as Stephanie said, the 1936 Olympics, when Hitler tried to make an example of the Aryan man being superior to all others and fell flat on his face when Jesse Owens defeated everybody in 3 or 4 events. And in fact, the U.S. had Jewish athletes at that point who also won medals. That was very symbolic. And we have seen that time and again, using sports as a weapon, as a tool. For example, to deny Israeli athletes have been kicked out of many events worldwide. Jackie Robinson, you mentioned, in the Southern Cone in Argentina. At one point, Uruguay and Argentina played a game in the 1920s, a soccer game, and Uruguay had a black player. And the crowd started throwing things at him and everything. So it's a very negative way of using sports to promote prejudices and things like that. And governments have tried to use sports to regain popularity. For example, Argentina, which had a military dictatorship in the 1970s, the economy was going to hell in a handbasket. There was civil war going on. So they said, okay, we're going to host a World Cup. And for a moment, they were successful because Argentina won the World Cup and they were able to regain some popularity. But it can fall flat, it can be a double-edged sword for you. When Brazil decided to host a World Cup in 2014, they spent a lot of money. I mean, soccer in Brazil is more important than religion, than anything you can think of. And they take it extremely seriously. So I think they thought it was a win-win to host a World Cup and then naturally win or at least make a good showing. Well, it didn't happen that way. Many of the stadiums they built turned out to be white elephants. A lot of money was unaccounted for, corruption allegations, et cetera. And to top everything off, Brazil played for the championship against Germany and lost 7-1, which of course made everybody in Argentina very happy, but not in Brazil. And there are some people who say that a sort of malaise took over Brazil for the next few years. And, you know, the people got fed up with politicians. The president, Dilma Rousseff, was impeached. Lula da Silva, the former president, is now in jail. And it all started, people say, with that defeat of Brazil in the World Cup. So sports can be a weapon, can be a tool for good, but it can also be used for more nefarious purposes.
You talked about that feeling that really only sports can provide, especially if it's something you grew up with as a child. It's something that it's your family's team, or it's your nation. You're wrapped up in the Olympics or in the World Cup, in a national event. I obviously governments try to take advantage of that and try to use that. I wonder if, and you did mention ancient Greece. We can go back as far as that, where sports have a larger than life presence. Mm-hmm. But it feels, at least economically, in this country, certainly, athletes have a larger and larger presence. They're part of our everyday lives. As you mentioned, LeBron James, they're part of our cultural media. They're in movies. They have rap albums. They have they extend beyond just the field of play, and they make so much more money than the average citizen that they maybe have an outdo influence in our society. I'm curious. We looked at 2016. Vladimir Putin drove his ratings, his approval ratings, way up with the Olympics, and then almost immediately invaded Crimea. We've watched even we're still seeing it play out as far as the Korean Peninsula
right.
and how that's going to work. But as recently as a couple of weeks ago, the Chechen warlord threw his arm around Mo Salah, the Egyptian star, as soon as they got to the World Cup and their last couple days of training, and paraded around and said he's a great, sort of ambassador for us, and tried to use him as an image lift for his own purposes. Do you have any worries that with the growing outsized importance of sports, that more of this is coming down, in the future, that there will be more political actors trying to co-opt this for their own reasons?
Well, I think it's something that has happened often in history, and I don't see that changing. I mean, even somebody like Dennis Rodman, famous NBA player, tried his own brand of diplomacy with North Korea and now feels vindicated. So yeah. I think we have to remember sports stars are people, and they may be great at sports, but they may not be, the ultimate authority on foreign policy or on values, etc. So we sometimes worship them a little too much.
What?
Some deserve worshiping, but not all.
Soolmaz, you talked about the ability for sports to humanize in a way, and I wanted to get back into that a little bit. From your own personal experiences in the various tournaments that you've competed in, when you've gone abroad, what have you seen in terms of that? Maybe not even in your own competitions, but in competitions between others, where you're on the sidelines. Have you seen that develop? Have you seen countries who do not agree on political fronts, their athletes come together in ways that sort of transcend that and turn the other person into more than just a competitor, and into more than a representation of their country, but into a real human being?
Yeah, I mean, I did see one, in all my years, I did see one incident play out that was not so hot. It was between, it was around the time of Crimea incident, right? And it was a Ukrainian athlete and a Russian athlete. And they had met in a match. And that match ended up in that was a longer match than usual. And there was intense emotions there, and in our fights, usually our main goal is to attain an emotional stability. That's what we're striving for. And that match was quite intense. That was different than any matches, and so maybe one or two penalties, and we're quick to give penalties, but there were some penalties there. So I saw that play out, but that was one incident out of how many years of competition. And but I've seen incidences where athletes from different countries, it takes a couple, like we'll see each other and we'll judge each other on face value, and then we'll meet up in a competition or not, and then afterwards, after the competition is over, I have seen many incidences where we'll go up to one another and we'll ask about this type of movement you did, or that was a great timing that you had, or something, and it always starts with like one little approach to make a compliment, and that usually opens up an athlete, just the fact that you show respect. And that's what the bottom line. The bottom line is that athletes show one another respect, and that happens at the people-to-people exchanges. Now, that may not translate into a foreign policy change, but that's a different discussion. But yes, I have seen many examples of that, and it usually starts with one athlete showing respect to the other, and frankly being open and not judging the person just because of the flag that they wear. So that's very general answer to your question, but yes, I have.
Yeah, and let's not forget in 1956, after the Soviet Union had invaded Hungary, at the Olympic Games in '56 in Melbourne, the Soviet Union and Hungary played for the gold medal in water polo.
Yeah.
And that pool was red with blood. I think Hungary won, but they extracted their pound of flesh from the Soviets.
Absolutely.
So I want to open up to the floor for anyone who has questions for either of our panelists, or for me for some reason, but hopefully for them. Feel free to raise your hand and what's that? Oh, we have a microphone over on the left. You can come over and ask your question.
By the way, many athletes are worthy of admiration and do a lot of good community work, so
That's true.
I didn't mean
Thank
to
you.
imply.
Hi, thank you again for coming. My name is Alexis Valdivinos. I am a local nonprofit founder. I really appreciate your time coming out tonight to talk about this really interesting topic and the role of sports in diplomacy. I was wondering, one of the things that kind of come up to my mind is the role of sporting associations like the IOC and FIFA. And I was wondering, especially on the micro level, what would you recommend to individuals who want to influence communities and yet see these associations that are supposed to fight racism and conflict and really trying to instill a grassroots movement and see them struggle with it, particularly in recent years? FIFA has been an unfortunate example of the problems of graft and corruption. What would you recommend to people who really want to put a positive influence on this and use some of that goodwill that sport really does have to offer?
So what would I recommend to the athlete itself, himself or herself?
I think it's both to the athlete and the audience because, as you know, there are millions and millions of people who are watching these games, and particularly in major sport, in competitions like the World Cup, you have almost billions of viewers.
Yeah, so, for athletes, first of all, it depends on what camp you fall in, right? There's some people who think athletes just stick to your sport and just that's what you're good at and that's it. And there's some people who are like, no, you have a large platform and you can influence a lot that's happening, so use that. So for the athlete, I would say that make sure that you understand what issue if you're trying to address, for example, racism, right? Make sure you understand what is racism, where does it come from, how does it manifest in your community. Find partner organizations that you could work with that could help your initiatives get launched, right? Be that spokesperson to the extent that you can. Some may be bound by certain organizational rules, like to not speak out. Some may be worried about how that's going to impact their future, their sports future, and that's important for them. And if that is, then maybe they might want to work indirectly and not so directly with partner organizations to do some work. So there's different ways that you can do it. Media certainly helps to get a message across. So partnering with medias when and if an athlete is ready to do so is going to help broaden and transmit their message more widely. Anything else you want to add?
I think maybe you should comment on it because you know these organizations better than me. So.
Well, I mean, it's. I think it dives into what we were talking about in terms of governments co-opting the sort of goodwill of sport. You often see the corporate side of that too, right? And that's sort of filtered up, I think maybe the most obviously through the two groups that you mentioned. I want to go back to what your actual question was as far as you're talking about as far as how do athletes affect change or how do organizations or
More like organizations and individuals like us.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, as a sports writer, I just try to do it by calling it out when I see it. I wrote a piece about the Brazil Olympics, and if you have a chance to check out, Real Sports did an incredible. It was about Olympics in general, but they had an entire section going into the Rio Olympics, where they went down and they really drilled down on the street level and found that 80,000 residents had been moved so that they could build the Olympic facilities with no permanent housing. Temporary housing that was going to take them through maybe a year and a half, and then good luck, and moved out of the homes that they grew up in, and no choice. The government comes in and just does that, and they went and found that the water issue that they said they would clean up, that they promised that the bays would be clean, that they weren't, and they had no chance of being, and it's. When there are promises made, which there always are, whether it's Qatar saying that they're going to build brand new air conditioning facilities and invent this new form of air conditioning in time for the Olympics, well, okay, one, you have to question whether or not that's possible, and then if they don't deliver, point it out and say this is the only reason that a country in the middle of the desert got a game that's supposed to be played in the summertime, and they had to move it to the wintertime, and even then they didn't follow through on it. So from my perspective, it's just making sure that when those things are said and done, that when we get to the end of it, we take real account of what actually happened, of where the people are now. Everybody forgets about these dislocated people in Brazil, but where are they now? Did that get fixed? And not just roll on to the next competition and roll on to the next Olympics and the next World Cup.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Aisha. I'm WAC DC staff. Thank you guys for coming tonight and engaging in this conversation. It really sparked my curiosity, actually, about the link between survivors of violence and people who are currently living through conflict or have come from a conflict situation, refugees, people who are asylum seekers, and those players on the field and kind of. My question is about how much coaching happens on the field versus off. I mean, maybe Soolmaz, you could talk about this a bit, and Ambassador Gutierrez, about the different initiatives that are going on to kind of make amends with the kind of the field, playing on the field versus going home and actually dealing with the conflicts that they are experiencing and kind of if that makes sense a little bit.
Okay, so how much work goes? A lot of the organizations that work with refugees, for example, or any whatever their target population is, they do a lot of work outside. So they have games and they create leagues, for examples, and they teach them these skill sets in sport, whatever the sport is. Typically, it's the biggest sports are basketball and soccer, right? So the organizations tend to focus on those, but they teach them these skills. But it's really not about them becoming this like all-star soccer player or basketball player. It's really to just get them to come to the programs. They learn, they move, they become physically active. It's all a kind of side benefit. But then outside it, they have these programs where they provide spaces for them to get mentored on whatever subject they're working on in school. They provide various educational services, whether it's about nutrition, whether it's about school, whether it's about self-regulation, emotional control, things like this. So there's actually a lot. These organizations do a lot of work outside the the sport component of it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't have much to add, but sports can be a very important building block in helping kids with problems or kids coming from disadvantaged areas. Even in this country, you see that there are midnight basketball leagues that are organized by cities to reduce crime and to keep people occupied in high crime neighborhoods, et cetera. So sports can be a very useful tool when you have these groups that are displaced or having problems.
Thanks.
Hello, my name is Lauren. I'm also a WalkDC staff, and I'd also like to thank the panel for coming tonight. My question is a bit more specifically for Noah, and it concerns kind of the recent ethical dilemma that's been sparked in journalism regarding how much attention and coverage journalists give to, say, political stunts or sensational stories. How, is it productive, really? Is it, does it matter? And my question is, if you look more specifically at sports and kind of the mixture of sports and politics, athletes or sports teams using their platform to push political agendas or the other way around, do you find those conversations to be productive? And does that kind of the question of ethics apply to that as well?
I would say broadly, my view is if you have a platform and people are paying attention to you, it's not my job to tell you what you can and can't do with that. If you, I think it was Malcolm Jenkins, the Eagles player, that was one of the most intriguing ways of sort of using his platform. This was recently. He didn't say anything. He wrote stuff out on signs. Yeah. And he went from sign to sign. And so, I mean, you have to put the camera on him if you're going to report the story, and you're getting exactly what he's writing down. And his point was, I'm not going to be taken out of context. I'm not going to have a quote pulled that is going to be used against me. Here, this is it. If you're going to come to my locker, this is what I want to talk about. And it was an extension of everything that we've seen the last 2 years in the NFL with the sort of mixed conflating of what people are actually protesting and why they're protesting and if it's respectful and all this. It was to cut through all of the side arguments that distract from that. So I mean, my view is, and I've met some really interesting athletes who have been willing to risk alienation from their teams, and if they're willing to do that and they're willing to use the platform that they've worked to get. As a journalist, I'm not going to ignore that. I'm going to try to report it as fairly as I can and ask them the questions. If they want to talk about it, hopefully they've done their homework, and a lot of them have, and a lot of them actually have stuff to say. Get into it, ask them the questions, really get into to what they want to get out in their message.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Sarah. I'm the Director of Global Education with World Affairs Council, and I want to thank you all so much for coming tonight and your expertise and insights on this topic. My question is directed to Soolmaz. You mentioned that there's both a need for both qualitative and quantitative research on the impact of sports and its role in diplomacy or engaging conflict. And I have two questions. One is, could you share a little bit what the qualitative report is on sports and diplomacy or sports and conflict? And what are some of the feel-good stories that are compelling that come out of sports exchanges that you've mentioned a couple times? And then my second question would be, if there's a need for more quantitative research, what are some of the quantitative questions that you have to probe in this field? Thank you.
Okay, both very good questions. So some of the feel-good stories are that there'll be tons of pictures, so they'll show like the happy kid smiling, right? Or like an Israeli kid and a Palestinian kid like arm in arm, and they're becoming friends or they're playing together, and they describe these episodes mostly, right, in there to say, look, my work is is doing good job. We're bridging divides. We're giving them the opportunity, and all of that is true, right? So there's all these kinds of feel-good stories. It's around happiness, and we've come together, unity, so to speak. And it's not that those are being made up. They are seeing moments of those things coming together, that unity, but how well that translates into like a resolution of the conflict itself is a bigger discussion. So those kind of qualitative stories are being narratives are being explained. Of course, in more detail, that's not doing all of it justice. But then for quantitative, I would probably pose questions such as, how many participants do you have? How many family members are engaged? Family members of those participants being engaged, because culture plays a big role, right? You bring them into the program. They learn all these skills. They go home, and they might be off for the summertime, for example, and all they're left with is basically whatever their family preaches and believes, right? And so culture is hugely powerful in that case. And so basically, how many families have been engaged? Are parents involved? What's the number of families that are being engaged as well, not just participants? So questions around numbers, certainly, but also questions about how does this translate into the bigger problem you're trying to address. So, for example, in kids who are, or programs that are trying to address obesity, right? So some of the questions we could pose are, what are the rates? Like, what baseline did you get when the kids came in? How do you record those numbers? How do you record those measurements? And then after a certain amount of practice, or the program, what were the results there? How did they improve over time? We also need, in order to get good results, we need long-term studies as well. So some of these short-term studies are probably not going to, it'll only give us a glimpse of the power. So we need long-term studies that measures the effects a little bit more. Probably I would focus my questions around effects, around numbers of how much are we engaging, and also long-term. Just a general thought.
Hello, everybody. My name is Robert Brown. I'm a WAC member. And my question is for the ambassador, Gutierrez. Yes. I want to first say I do appreciate your example using the World Cup in Brazil. As somebody who went to Manaus in 2014, which is the biggest white elephant stadium, I kind of saw firsthand, kind of the periphery, what was not shown on TV, and the damage that caused. But getting back to my question, Ambassador, as athletes, you were talking about soft power with the professional athletes, and there's a lot of people in the world that know who LeBron James is, but they don't know who Donald Trump or Barack Obama is. How do you deal, as athletes get their voice, how do you deal with athletes who are against the government's policies or who are very outspoken about our government's policies? As you know, LeBron James has gone on a couple of these shows and talked about some of the policies of the current administration. You have the NFL players who are taking knees. So as a government official in these countries, how do you deal with that, and how much damage does that cause?
Very good question. I think the strength of our country is our values. And I was in Argentina when the U.S. invaded Iraq. And the vast majority of Argentines were against our policy. And then the Abu Ghraib pictures came out and everything. And it was a field day for every anti-American person to come out and to attack the United States. And I just had a very simple defense. Where did these pictures come out? They came out from the Pentagon website. Who revealed them? The U.S. government. Would your government have done that? I think it is our greatest strength. So whether somebody disagrees or agrees with the current government, the fact that he's an American or she's an American and feels that they can speak their mind, I think is the greatest defense of this country. So it wouldn't bother me at all.
Thank you. That's actually a really good answer. Thanks a lot.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cheyenne Boise. I'm with the Confucius Institute U.S. Center. Thank you all so much for being here. It's been a great conversation. In my master's research, I studied peace education, and so I have a follow-up question, actually, for Soolmaz about the evaluation question. I had the same question as Sarah, but thinking in peace education is also very similar to sports diplomacy. It's a field where you have to do a certain level of convincing to people, and the evaluation has to be there. So do you feel that the current level of evaluation is enough to convince people that sports diplomacy is something that should be invested in and is something that works, regardless of the sometimes lack of the quantitative research when you do have so much qualitative? And then what is your advice to someone like me who does work in peace education and knows that these programs work, talk to people who, have benefited from these programs, but are still a very small, part of the sector?
Yeah, I think I think we're putting a huge emphasis on increasing our research base, which we need, and I think the way to go is to keep sharing what we do, keep sharing these qualitative stories because they are important. They do tell a certain narrative of what's happening. So I would say, repeat your question, the first part of your question to me again.
Yeah, do you feel that it's enough? What needs to happen next for us to feel like we have a stronghold in the field to say that sports diplomacy works? We know it works, and this is why. What needs to happen next to continue to build that?
Well, I think continue the research for one. We can never be limited or have a lack of research per se. And two, I think if we were able to show that that these micro level engagements, right, these people-to-people exchanges have greater values, for example, that they translate into policy change, then I think we're on to something bigger. I think that would be a next step. So, we have envoys who go around and they share about American values and cultures. We have exchanges that do they do great work, but perhaps having follow-on methods where we can keep in touch with those participants, for example, of those exchanges, and then hoping that those people have the skills to be leaders in their countries. I think then that would help to translate into some more policy change based on the direct learning that they've had. So I think that might be the next step, is to explore how can these efforts translate into some bigger policy changes. For yourself, I would say just keep doing what you're doing. We need people to just keep doing what we're doing, right? We're going to make mistakes, but through them we have lessons learned, and we use that to do better work. And that's just going to be the natural progression of it. We're lucky that we're dealing with something like sports, which the ambassador and Noah we've talked about, is so highly spirited, so contagious, and all of that good stuff. So it's easy to draw people in, and that's going to stay the case. That's not going to change. And so I would just keep doing what you're doing. With peace, peace education. How much conflict do we have in this world, right? How much unity and peace do we need, right? We have a conflict in whichever place you could put your finger on the map. So we need peace, right? And we need to educate people about that. So just keep what you're doing.
Cool. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Spelle, just a college student interning in DC this summer. So a lot of people say sports can serve as a way to uplift people, especially people living in poor neighborhood, because you see some professional sports stars, just play the ball when they were young and they grow up and they move themselves out of the situation. But at the same time, increasingly, I guess you see with the advancements of technology, if you can have better access to, say, technology, better access to coaching, you get a natural advantage. So I'm just wondering how, in your opinion, can sport continue serving as a way to promote this social mobility?
Let me just say one. I think
Yeah.
all of us have a comment about this one, but I mean, I think sport is very important. I think it can serve a very positive role for these for kids. But at the same time, sports should not be stressed at the expense of general education. I think it has to be a combination of both. I think we have to look at the realities of sports, like playing football today is not what it used to be with concussions and things like that. I had 3 daughters. If I had a son, I don't know if I would have wanted him to play football in this day and age. Many kids look at LeBron James and everything and think I can be him, and they have to know to be realistic that only 1 out of a million gets to be LeBron James. Only less than 1% of high school basketball players get to the NBA and things like that. So sports can play a role, but not at the expense of education and preparing yourself for the world in other areas.
Just to sort of follow on that, it's funny, you brought up football, and I've done a fair amount of digging into the safety issues around football, especially in terms of brain injuries, and that's one of my biggest concerns is that there are different classes of the game now. Like, aside from whatever the fundamental things that need to be fixed in the sport, you have these $600 helmets now that have all these extra ways of reducing rotational forces and all the things that lead to long-term brain damage. But if you're at a public high school in a blue-collar area, you're getting the $80, Riddell helmet. You're not getting that helmet. You might be getting a helmet that's 5 years old. You might be, you're not getting all the additional technology pieces. You're not getting the better training and practices. You're not getting every single advantage that makes it a safer game for a richer kid. And so you're actually playing a more dangerous version of the same sport. But more to your broader point, I had a really, really interesting discussion a few weeks ago with John Amici, who he's a really fascinating guy. He's mostly well known because he was one of the first pro athletes to come out as gay after he retired. But he's a very, very interesting person who really wanted to be a psychologist more than he wanted to be a basketball player. And that's sort of what he deals in is psychology. And I asking him as somebody who came out of England. He's British, and he ended up in the NBA. It was such an unexpected path to end up where he did. Do you believe in the power of sport as a social uplifting tool? And he said, not really. He said, it's not sports. It's having somebody who believes in you. It's having a mentor, and that can be a coach, and certainly that works. But he said, without my high school coach, none of what I am as an athlete, as his profession now, none of that would have happened. He taught me to push myself and to set goals for myself and to hold me accountable to those goals. And so to me, that resounded a lot with me having seen the athletes that succeed or the athletes that don't succeed as they go on, is having somebody as a guiding force. And I don't think that has anything to do with athletics necessarily. It's whatever that is in whatever you strive to be in life.
Interestingly, Noah, that's one of the key themes that came up in my research is that those who are very heavily involved in this sports for peace building or conflict resolution field, they say that they are the person that they are because of the sport opportunities that sports gave them. And some of them were not talented all-star athletes, but they had coaches who were able to guide them in a proper way. And so they have components in their programs where they develop, where they bring these kids in and they train them to be future coaches so that then they can give back. So the role of coaches is absolutely huge in how an athlete is shaped, not just as an athlete, but really as a person too.
Thank you.
Hi. I'm just curious to see what you thought about the changing landscape of sports with the advent of technology. As you know, esports is one of the major trends coming on board. And I was just wondering, how will technology change sports and diplomacy? And in reference to esports, video games, and anything new? Thanks.
Well, technology can be a pain in the butt sometimes. If you're a football fan, you have to wait 30 minutes for the conclusive video, then you lose the flow of the game. But I suppose it's, at the end of the day, it makes for more accurate results, so we have to accept it. But sometimes we get too enamored with technology, we forget the fundamentals of everything. So I think in general it's a good thing. As far as sports and diplomacy, I guess these days there are no barriers. I mean, it's with social media and with communications, we can be anywhere in seconds. So although social media can get you in trouble sometimes, so as many athletes have found. So you have to be wise about it, but I do think it's a good thing. And as far as diplomacy, social media has played a role in exposing human rights violations and things like that to populations that might not have access to information in other ways. So it does have a very positive side as well.
On the technology point, I think that it certainly gives us a more precise and fair game in most sports, and maybe a more informed one in terms of all the statistics, but not necessarily a more exciting one. So, you can pick and choose there. And just real quick, I'll touch on esports since you talked about it. I've been watching from afar mostly on esports because it's so foreign and it doesn't feel like sports to me. It feels like something else that's not quite sports. What's going to be really interesting moving forward, from my perspective, coming from traditional sports, is you have the NBA and the NFL, but really the NBA, investing in trying to capture this sort of incredible amount of people who are interested in esports and bring them into their game with this NBA 2K game that they've invested in a whole league of players and everything. But that's not really how esports works. Esports is this organic, these fan movements grow up on their own. And so I'm not sure if that's going to work exactly. I don't know if they can reverse engineer the excitement that naturally crops up around this. There's certainly a ton of people who are interested in the idea of esports and in certain esports, but I don't know how that's going to translate yet to traditional sports and how that gets brought back into the fold of traditional sports.
I have one last question to close us out. Circling back to our initial inspiration of the World Cup, U.S. relations with our neighbors to the north and south, Canada and Mexico, have seemed more antagonistic than they may have been in previous eras. But then U.S., Mexico, and Canada have been awarded the 2026 World Cup bid to jointly host the World Cup. Do you see that as a tool that will oversee the current situation of relations, or is it that the current situation of relations will end up driving countries apart as they try to come together to host this major international event?
Well, let's
We'll
see.
finish on a light one.
Yeah.
There's a presidential election in 2024, right? Anyway, might depend on who's president. But no, I think, look, there's a lot of rhetoric out there. There's a lot of ill will in many circles. But I think in the people-to-people sense, Mexico and Canada are still two of our top trade partners, although with these tariffs, who knows. But, I don't think it'll affect the cooperation between the three. I mean, the three countries got together to make the bid for the World Cup and coordinated. So I think it could have a positive effect. And I hope relations are not bad by that time. I hope we can overcome all these rhetorical flourishes and stuff.
It's tough to imagine what anything's going to look like in 8 years, even just from a sports perspective. But the one thing that I would say that I'm encouraged by, as much as I don't love the bidding process in the IOC and FIFA, is I'd rather have it be hosted in a country that has the infrastructure already, which the U.S. and Canada and Mexico. I mean, they're not going to have to build new stadiums to do this, so it's going to cost your general taxpayer a lot less money. It's going to be the infrastructure is already there. it doesn't require what we've seen over some of these more recent international competitions. I'm of the fan of sort of the rotating Olympic model. Have like 3 major cities that have it on different continents they can rotate between, and maybe have a rotational 4th city, but to try to cut down on that. So I think regardless, at least there's that. At least it'll be less sort of waste in creation of the infrastructure for the event.
Ditto. No, I think it's going to be hard to see how it'll play out. I don't think if there's any momentary, tensions between any of them. I think as long as each are benefiting from other relations, other political policy relations, then I think it'll just be like a little glimpse in time. So I think there's more than sport and the bid to consider, and how the country's relations are going to be with each other at the end of the day.
Well, thank you all for participating and giving of your time and sharing your expertise with us this evening. Please join me in thanking them.